Hi guys, this is going to be my first video in a little biochemistry series here, talking about a typical biochemistry unit in a biology classroom, and we're going to start with the carbohydrates. Now, with the biochem unit and the videos I'm going to make with the series, these are going to be the large molecules, the large organic molecules that are going to allow our cells and therefore our bodies to function and do all the things that we need to do. And so we'll talk about carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, which are fats, and nucleic acids, and talk about the functions they have, the structures, talk about everything you might need to know in terms of the biochemistry of these molecules. So like I said, we'll start with these carbohydrates here. Now, if you've been in a bio classroom or taken biology before, you've probably heard the words monomer and polymer before. Those are just two general terms to describe types of molecules. And so monomers are typically going to be single, smaller building blocks that you can use to build polymers. Polymers will be the larger, more complex molecules that are made of a number of monomers. And so an analogy I use for that is like if you're building a train, like on a train track that's going to, deliver some type of goods. One train car would be like a monomer. The overall train, the whole big long train that you might see on the train tracks driving along, that would be a polymer. So a larger piece built together. All of these large molecules that we talk about in the biochemistry unit have specific names of molecules that fall into those monomer and polymer categories. And so for carbohydrates, we call them monosaccharides. Okay, these are going to be our small building blocks of the larger carbohydrates. Mono meaning one, saccharide or saccharide meaning sugar. So one or simple sugar. So these are going to be the very simple molecules. We call these the simple sugars. And these are going to be broken down very easily and readily for energy. So in terms of the simple sugars that these monosaccharides are, you would find these mostly in like fruit sources, or typically like when you see sugar on the back of a nutrition label for like candy or anything like that, it's going to be mostly one of these molecules. Now, when we're talking about monosaccharides, we mostly focus on three when we look in the biology classroom. That's going to be the glucose, the fructose, and the galactose, with us mostly focusing on glucose because that is going to be the most important one. That is the one that our bodies will readily break molecules down into to use for energy. And that is because glucose is the most easily broken down molecule in our cells for energy because it readily goes through the cellular respiration process in the mitochondria, which is for another section, another unit. When we talk about respiration and photosynthesis, they kind of go hand in hand in the bioenergetics section. But glucose is readily broken down and provides us the most energy per molecule in the most efficient way. So glucose is going to be the most important. It's also the most important because that is what energy really starts out at in terms of trophic levels. Now, we all know energy comes from the sun, and plants are able to convert that energy from the sun into glucose. And then we as organisms, we as heterotrophs, humans, and other animals eat plants, we obtain that glucose, and we then use that for our energy. The key thing to remember is that plants are actually making sugar, glucose, for themselves. Plants also need energy to do things, to do their cellular processes and maintain their daily functions. So they're making it for themselves. We, as more complex organisms, are just able to eat them and then kind of steal that energy from them. So, but glucose is the main energy molecule found in a lot of sources, and we'll talk about where that's found. Fructose, same molecular formula. Actually, these three, glucose, fructose, and galactose, are all going to be C6, H12, and O6. So they have the same molecular formula, but they have different structure. And those are called isomers. So they are isomers of one another. So same molecular formula, but different structures, and therefore different molecules with different functions. Fructose is going to be found a lot in fruits, and it is going to be a little bit sweeter, so there is a slight difference to it. And it is also processed a little bit differently in our bodies when we take it in. So you can use fructose for energy, just not as easily or not as efficient as using glucose. Okay, and those are our monosaccharides. These are the ones we are going to use to build all of our bigger pieces. Okay, So if we move along to our next grouping, and that is going to be the polysaccharides. So these are going to be our complex molecules built from our monosaccharides. Now, these are the main three that we look at in biology classroom, okay? So we have starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Starch and cellulose are going to be found in plants. Glycogen is found in animals, okay, like us, humans. Now, the key thing to remember here, and again, we'll talk about this, I'm going to go through each one individually. These are built from monosaccharides, one of those three that we just mentioned. And all of these three are built from repeating units of glucose. Glucose is the monomer that is going to build these larger pieces. And you can kind of see that if you look at these individual molecules, these monomers that are put together to form these long chains. Okay, those are all glucose molecules. And they are bound together, and they form these larger structures that are much more complex and therefore provide a more complex function. Okay? The big takeaway from this slide, and again, we're going to go into each of these individually, is notice the structural difference. Okay? The structural difference is going to be a huge a factor. In biology, you know, if you take in biology or if you're in it right now, your teacher is probably saying a lot of the time that structure determines function. I know I say it a lot with my students. So the structure of molecules is going to determine how they function. So if you look at starch and glycogen, you should notice that they have a different structure than cellulose over here. And that is for a specific reason, which we will mention as we go through. Okay? Just something to keep in mind as we move along. Our first molecule, polysaccharide that we find is starch. And starch is going to be an energy storage molecule that you find in plants. So you've probably heard, you know, of like starchy vegetables, you know, maybe things like potatoes, rice, pasta, beans, corn, so on and so forth. Starch is just a molecule that is storing energy for plants. So when plants do photosynthesis, they make glucose. They use that glucose for energy they need to do cellular processes, to maintain their daily functions. Whatever they don't need, whatever is left over, they then store as starch. So plants will have all these glucose molecules floating around, okay? So each one of these rings is a separate glucose, okay? So they'll have a bunch of these glucose floating around, and if they don't need them, they then combine them into a large molecule called starch that they can store in their cells, in little nodules throughout the plant, okay? And therefore, when they run out of energy, if they don't have enough glucose available, they can then just break down these bonds, break starch apart, and they can actually get glucose back out, and therefore they have energy to use, okay? Now, the way they combine together, okay, the way these glucose molecules are held together is through something called a glycosidic bond or a glycosidic linkage, okay? So that is the type of bond that holds carbohydrates together, and it's characterized by this oxygen in the middle here, okay? You can see that, and that's how they're all connected in the middle, okay? So one glucose here is connected by a glycosidic bond to another glucose here. And therefore, if we want to break apart this molecule of starch and get energy out, all we have to do is break these glycosidic bonds, and now we can use the individual glucose molecules for energy. Okay. Now, obviously, us humans or other animals, as we eat plants, we also take in their starch. When we digest it, through the process of digestion, we can then break those down into the individual glucose and use those for energy as well. Now, the other form of energy storage is called glycogen, and this is going to be the form in animals. So just like plants, we take in glucose or we take in starch, we break it down or we use it, and if we have some left over that we don't need at the moment, we will store it as glycogen, okay? We store glycogen in the liver and in the muscles, okay? And there's very good reasons for that. The muscles, you know, if you can imagine what is going to need the most energy in terms of your body, your brain actually uses the majority of energy that you take in. But besides that, your muscles are actually going to need a good bit as well. So it makes sense to store your energy producing molecules in the muscles where they're readily available to easily break down and go right to the source where they are needed. The other place they're stored, that glycogen is stored, is the liver, and that is because the liver is really pivotal, really important in blood sugar regulation and dealing with those hormone levels such as insulin and glucagon. So it does really help with blood sugar regulation, helping with the uptake and release of blood sugar, blood glucose. So if we need to allow some blood sugar, some glucose back into the blood, if we need to put sugar back into the blood, it makes sense that the liver would also have some glycogen stored up to help aid in that process. Now, the same way that we broke down starch is going to occur with glycogen. When we need some extra energy, when we run out of our glucose stores, we're going to tap into our backup, our glycogen. And all we need to do is break that glycosidic bond that you see between these molecules. Now, one of the big differences you'll see in structure between starch and glycogen is that starch is typically a linear molecule. Now, you did see on that one slide that there is a form of starch that branches off a little bit, kind of like this structure. But a lot of times you'll see starch like this, very linear. Glycogen, as you can see here, does branch off, okay? So it forms almost like a tree branch. Just a slight difference in the structure. The bond is still the same. It's still a glycosidic bond, and they're typically facing downwards, as you can see. The oxygen is below these molecules here, okay? Your glycogen stores typically will run out if you don't eat for anywhere from 12 to 18 hours, depending on how much glycogen you have stored and your body, okay? So everybody's different. But if you don't eat for about a day, your glycogen will completely be used up, and then you'll tap into fat. But glycogen is typically going to be your backup energy store. So for example, people who do endurance events, like marathoners, cross-country runners, people who do events where they're exerting energy for a long amount of time, they typically do what we would call the carb up or the carb loading. And so basically what they're doing is filling their glycogen stores in their body, filling up their muscles, filling up their liver, trying to tap out their energy tank. That way, when they're participating in their event the next day or a few days from then, once they burn through their glucose, they have a lot of that glycogen ready to be broken down and used for energy, so they don't bonk, is a typical term endurance athletes use. They bonk out or they hit the wall, per se. So this helps them kind of avoid that, all right? And so the third polysaccharide we talk about is cellulose, and this is going to be a structural support in plants. So where you see cellulose is going to be the cell wall of plant cells, okay? And it is a structural support, so it's going to help the plant cells stay rigid, stay firm, and that helps keep the plant upright. So trees, flowers, bushes, anything plant-based that has a stem or has a stalk and stands upright and stays very rigid, that's all thanks to cellulose here. Now, if you notice the difference in the structure from the other molecules we talked about starch and glycogen having more of a branched or a straight chain, and the bonds were all facing downward, those glycosidic bonds. Cellulose actually forms stacks and layers itself. And there's also actually hydrogen bonds that form between these layers that add an extra layer of security, of support. The other thing that's different is if you look at the glycosidic bonds here, you notice that what they do is they actually alternate down, then up, down, then up. So their glycosidic linkage is actually alternating like a zigzag, okay? This slight difference in bond structure actually is very important. It helps with the rigidity and the strength of the plant, but it also prohibits animals like us, if we lack the enzyme to digest it, we cannot digest it. And so cellulose in terms of diet is going to be like fiber. We do not digest fiber. It just helps with digestion, okay? So we don't actually get any nutrients from it. It just helps move things along in our system. And so that is all due to that glycosidic bond that is slightly different. We don't have the enzyme to break it down, to digest it. We do have the enzyme to break down starch. I hope that was really helpful. If you have any questions or need any help with anything, just feel free to let me know. And hopefully that helps you out with the carbohydrates. So